Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This video will be a review of Kino Lorber's release of the 1946 post-war, or I should say immediately post-World War II thriller, and the film that actually first managed to deal with the subject matter of the formation of the Office of Strategic Services and secret agents and their operations in World War II. There were many films that tried to capitalize on this, but this managed to beat the others to the punch and be the first film released, and of course goes under the title of O.S.S. Again, from 1946, directed by Irving Pichel, written by Richard Maibaum, produced by Richard Maibaum, and starring the iconic Alan Ladd. Now, this film is not just important for it being the first film to deal with the Office of Strategic Services in and also in a rather realistic manner, but for me personally, I got so much out of this, as every Bond fan will, because this is so crucial to the formation of the James Bond film series. Because, of course, Richard Maibaum went on to write the vast majority of the original films and was one of the key and absolutely vital team members who essentially created the cinematic James Bond that we know of. And to be quite frank, of the cinematic James Bond in terms of the DNA of the character, if you look at the great screen stars of the past and the sort of American energy that Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman wanted to make sure was maintained, a great deal of the cinematic James Bond's DNA is Alan Ladd. I mean, it just is. And it, of course, is underlined by the fact that Ladd's personal screenwriter was Richard Maibaum, and it was Ladd going over to make films for Warwick Films for Cubby Broccoli and his partner at the time, Irving Allen, and bringing his screenwriter over. That's how Maibaum got to know Broccoli and got into the Warwick team, which was basically the core nucleus of what eventually became the Eon team on Dr. No in 1962. So you can really trace back the formulation of the James Bond films to certain key elements. Everybody will talk about the Hitchcock thrillers, which is absolutely essential, but unfortunately they usually just point to North by Northwest and just kind of leave it at that, when really you have to go all the way back to the 39 Steps at least, and the tradition of British spy fiction. But you should also go back to Foreign Correspondent, which is a great part of the Bond DNA in terms of its structure, and if you read through the actual cast and crew, you would realize that uncredited, one of the screenwriters was, of course, Richard Maibaum. But this film being a spy film and being in the immediate post-war time period and being able to do the subject matter justice and as realistically as possible with the incredible screen persona of Alan Ladd, who was not your typical 100% tough guy image that would be what was, I guess, more typically in vogue at the time, what you picture. He is not a John Wayne type. He has, in his screen persona, a great usage of silence and also a great sort of, some have labeled it a sort of feminine quality, but there is this great intelligence and a great deal of cynicism and a great sense of buried humor, almost with a touch of flippancy at times. And that's even including the way that he moves. He has a particular sense of movement. There is a definite cat-like grace in his actual movement and appearance on screen. Now, all of this would be totally familiar to Ladd fans, but if you pay attention, if you're a Bond fan, these should be sounding very familiar, because these are the exact same terms that everyone used to describe Sean Connery and what they were going for in the original films. So I think it's key to look at the Bond precursors, but absolutely top of the heap among those is this film, O.S.S. from 1946, and chiefly because it is a spy thriller written and produced by Richard Maibaum, striving to be as authentic and as realistic as possible. And Maibaum had, of course, come out of the war just like everyone else and had significant connections to the O.S.S. and higher military brass, which is actually how this film managed to get military cooperation and get out first in terms of production, and beat some of the other films that did not have that same sort of connection and cachet. So that's another layer of credibility that this film has. So for most people seeing this film, it's going to be a very interesting look at approaching the subject matter in 1946, immediately after the war had ended, and seeing an intelligence service being dramatized for the first time and trying to be as realistic as possible, or at least as realistic as you could be in 1946. So there's a sort of almost time capsule flavor to it in that sense, but it moves with a great pace, and that sense of realism really helps it along. And so for most people, that's what they're going to get out of it. But for Bond fans, this is... I think you could literally call this film the Rosetta Stone of James Bond, because there is so much of the core identity of not just the character, but the tone of the stories that we got in the films, the things that Maibaum strove for, balancing the extremely realistic with the highly suspenseful scenarios that these agents find themselves in. And just anytime Alan Ladd is on the screen, even though it's Alan Ladd and he's obviously not English, you could really start to think of this as a 1940s Bond film. I mean, it has that flavor. And of course, when you have the same writer who's also producing the film this time, it sort of makes sense how this would be. So Bond fans can look at this film, and without even trying, you're going to start noticing things and be like, oh, hey, that's kind of familiar. Even the entire opening sequence, it's not necessarily before the credits, but the whole opening sequence right after the credits fade out is kind of like a standalone mission, almost like it's the pre-title sequence from a Bond film. Essentially, what you get is a nice suspense sequence that is revealed to be a training scenario, and that, of course, would later turn up many, many, many different times. Of course, notably in the non-official Bond film "Never Say Never Again" and its opening. But even that, when you start to think about it, it's like, hey, that's really like the pre-title sequence. The whole flavor is there, and there's not really anything that's quite like that up to this point. The closest thing you had were the Hitchcock wrong man thrillers, particularly the 39 Steps, Foreign Correspondent, which Maibaum did write on, although uncredited, and Saboteur, films like that where you had the solo figure, usually coupled with a beautiful girl on the run, having to go through the suspense set pieces in order to solve the mystery and clear their name. Here, it's of course dealing with deep penetration agents who have to maintain their cover and secretly inform on the Nazis in that particular theater of the war and risk life and limb doing so, which is where the suspense comes in. So if you've never seen a film of this type, the best way to describe it would be if you remember the escapees in The Great Escape, when they're making all their plans and they're having to try and stay undercover to not reveal themselves as escaped prisoners of war. That's the sort of scenario that you're going to get in films like this. And what's fascinating about O.S.S. is that it takes the time to show the rudiments of the training process and essentially highlight how these agents are recruited, and it's from a wide variety of people. It's not just an Alan Ladd vehicle, it's essentially a team picture, although we don't get as much obviously from the other team members, but they're all brought together and put and inserted into a particular area in the theater of the war, and they actually parachute in there. So we actually get them doing a nighttime parachute invasion drop to go behind enemy lines, and then have to bury their chutes and put on civilian clothes and start making sure they use the correct terminology like they've trained for. But that's making the ticking clock is there in terms of when will they be discovered? Not will they be discovered, but when will they be discovered? Will it be something that gives them away? Will they themselves make a mistake and give themselves away? And how long can they keep this going? And also, interestingly, we get to play with the dramatic idea of what does this do to someone psychologically, which is very rare for a film of the 1940s, which helps to further ground the film. Another really important grounding factor is that, of course, as with most any film, especially at this time period, there has to be a female character, this time played by Geraldine Fitzgerald, but she's not just the token love interest. And it is actually, again, even more realistic when she is brought and presented to the team for the first time, which actually takes place during one of the London blitzes. They meet in a hotel room and the power goes out as the bombs are going off during a raid. So again, the attention to detail and realism is really substantial in this film. But the other team members, especially the Alan Ladd character, greet her with, shall we say, less than enthusiastic responses and worrying that her simply being a woman will compromise the mission in various ways. And of course, she proves her worth within a nanosecond and is just as good, if not better, than all of them combined. And none of this is overblown. There isn't a constant attempt at a romance scene that happens over and over and over again to force a love story between the two main characters. It all develops over time, and it's all on the back burner as the intensity of the situation they find themselves in continues. And then we get cutaways to the Home Office, where the lines of communication are severely compromised, and that adds to the levels of suspense that we have to worry about. They have to worry about how the radio transmissions will, if they will be picked up. How can they properly transmit without being detected? And of course, having to maintain the coded transmissions as well. So I want to stress that there is an incredible sense of realism in this film. It's not simply a World War II adventure film like many of the studios would do as propaganda pieces. And it's also not really a propaganda film. It is a post-war release. There is a little bit of a feeling, particularly at especially at the end, the very ending, like the bookends of the film, the start and finish, because I guess of the military cooperation that sort of it's not really patriotic, but it sort of uses that as a sort of gentle background at the very beginning and end. But it's also not afraid to have dark moments and have a really wonderful, very dramatic ending that really and truly works and it feels pretty much ripped out of the pages of history, like it was something that actually happened. Of course, this story is based on actual events, obviously heavily dramatized because this stuff was still classified at the time. But this was material nobody had ever really done before, particularly in the setting of the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, long before it would become the CIA. But it's the attention to detail, the level of realism that really sells this film. And then throughout, the constant feelings of, hey, this is like a Bond film, and it's just scattered all over. We have a sort of central villainous Nazi character who develops, shall we say, a particular physical handicap. There is technically no central villain of the film, but this character would come the closest to it, played by the great John Hoyt. He exudes menace, but also charm, and so I guess if the film had to have any sort of Bond villain surrogate type character, this particular Nazi officer comes the closest to that. But there's even a few of the sequences that I can't help but think of the actual Bond films. In particular, there is a sequence on a train, as all great romantic spy stories almost always have a train sequence in them, but it actually culminates in the train stopping in a tunnel, and Alan Ladd is skulking around in the shadows, and of course I immediately flash to Octopussy and being outside Octopussy's train in the train tunnel. But that's merely surface stuff, but that's where my brain was already at, because it's got so much of the feeling of a Bond film, and again, just to see Alan Ladd in a role like this, just the way that he moves, the way that he commands the screen, without even having any dialogue at the time, just his presence, that sort of detachment that he can have, the way that he could internalize emotion and have the varying layers of cynicism and flippant humor to very much disguise and break up the emotion that is lurking underneath. And this is woven beautifully into the love story that develops, and that, because it's been on the back burner the whole time, but it's allowed to simmer, essentially. It's allowed to grow and develop over time, because the film story takes place over an expanded period of time. It's not just one event, it's multiple events, and the stakes keep raising, and that plays into, again, the psychological aspect I mentioned, because there is literally a point towards the end of the film where they are making their dash to freedom, the surviving members of the team, and then are literally told, no, we need you to go back. and understandably, they don't want to go back. And it's a really surprising and honest moment for a film from 1946, coming right off the end of the war. You would think to have something much more fully patriotic and less realistic, where they would say, "Oh, sure, we're ready to keep the fight going." It's actually very realistic how that scene breaks down, and their commanding officer is played by the very underrated Patrick Knowles, who would be well known to any fan of Warner Brothers classics, and especially all fans of classic Universal horror films. So it's great seeing him here in a nice, bigger still supporting role, but a bigger, more commanding role, which he does perfectly. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the other wonderful little gag that Maibaum puts into the film that helps to humanize things further, when the member of the team who is always doing the radio communications develops this rather touching relationship with the radio operator at HQ, and the way that she sort of develops these feelings for a man she's never met, and they only communicate by these coded messages, and sometimes slip in personal messages in between them, and that plays out in a really nice, touching, humanizing fashion, which also then gets a nice dramatic gut punch in there too. So everything serves to heighten this drama that's building, even if it may seem like it's just humor or it's just enriching that particular moment in time. It's actually serving a greater purpose, which is something that Maibaum was really adept at. And again, I just can't get over how much of just a spiritual precursor to the James Bond films that O.S.S. is. It is a must-see for all Bond fans. If you considered yourself a Bond fan and you've never read up on the films, and you always wondered, oh well, what's sort of the sort of spiritual predecessors, or what's sort of led up to it, and you've seen a few Hitchcock films and you wonder, oh well, is there anything else? And you check out anything else that has to do with spies, you must check out O.S.S. from 1946. Alan Ladd is one of the handful of the absolute influences on the James Bond character in terms of the cinematic James Bond. Chiefly because Richard Maibaum wrote for him for so long, and then eventually Ladd came over to England, made films for Warwick, and then essentially made one of the other key Bond predecessor films in The Red Beret, which is also known as Paratrooper, in 1953. That was written by Richard Maibaum, photographed by Ted Moore, and even directed by Terrence Young. Most of the key crew of the Bond films was already in place at Warwick Films, and The Red Beret is really where everything came together, and it's starring Alan Ladd. There's even moments in that film that get not recycled or replicated, but are sort of echoes of what turn up in the Bond films. So it's a sort of another film like O.S.S. where there's so much of the Bond DNA there, and except that time you have even more of the key Bond team there in the crew. But seeing this film, and most especially because it's a spy film, and it just I don't know if there's a film that feels closer to a Bondian experience in the 1940s. I think you have Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, obviously, and Saboteur as well. There's a handful of other films, particularly the films that also dealt with spies that came out shortly after O.S.S. in 1946, like 13 Rue Madeleine and the Fritz Lang film Cloak and Dagger, for example. You could make the case for almost any sort of spy film, or a lot of noir detective thrillers even having Bondian elements, and these were of course also influences on Ian Fleming as well before he started writing the novels and created the character. But it is this film that, and particularly because Richard Maibaum wrote and produced it, I mean that's just that's why, and because Alan Ladd is such a big part of the James Bond cinematic character's DNA in terms of the influences on Bond, the character. This film is literally a Rosetta Stone for the James Bond films. It just simply is. And that is why it is so crucial for any fan of the Bond films who wants to understand the sort of formulation of the series, and what are the important key films that led to this sort of primordial soup that birthed the Bond films. Chief amongst those is 1946's O.S.S., a truly underrated World War II thriller, or I should say post-war thriller, that strives for as much historical accuracy and realism as I possibly could do in 1946, and is not afraid to go a darker path in terms of the story content in a more realistic way, but also having requisite humor and things to enrich in the experience and make it an enjoyable film instead of just being constant suspense and darkness. In fact, it does remind me, there are very few studio World War II films that dared to go quite this dark. And while I was watching the film, I kept being reminded of one of the riskiest of the Errol Flynn World War II films made for Warner Brothers, which was 1944's Uncertain Glory, where Flynn actually is playing a traitorous character who is essentially he's not quite blackmailed, but he winds up having a crisis of conscience as he's going to essentially be let off to be executed, and starts carrying out covert operations for the Allies in France. It's a very dark film. It's of course completely, it is semi based on true events, but it's also a Flynn vehicle for Warner Brothers. But it's definitely the darkest of the World War II standalone thrillers that he did, not counting Objective Burma. But that's the sort of film I'm reminded of when I'm watching O.S.S., because it is a film that isn't afraid to be darker. And it's also surprising that, it managed to come out when it did, and it was part of those other films I mentioned, 13 Rue Madeleine and Cloak and Dagger, amongst a few others, that were dealing with the OSS as a new organization and being the first films to do so. So they sort of wanted to come out right there in 1946 when this was a brand new and hot topic. It was just OSS that managed to beat them to the punch and come out first. So here we have Kino's Blu-ray, which has rather lovely artwork, which very much tells you the tone and flavor of this film wonderfully. It's in their standard case design, so it is just a standard Kino disc. This is credited as a brand new 2K master licensed from Universal, and it actually does have special features in the form of the original trailer and a lovely new Sam Deegan commentary. In terms of the actual transfer specs, this film has not had a long video history. It had a release on VHS, which is very uncommon, and then it finally got an MOD DVD from the Universal Vault series. So I would guess this master was made for that, perhaps, or, well, I guess since it says it's new, I guess maybe it's for this Blu-ray and and then perhaps the MOD DVD is the old VHS master. But anyway, just basically saying this film's not had a lot of video releases because it is much more of an obscure title. This was a film I read about for years, and it took me forever to even be able to see it. And then I never thought it would get a Blu-ray release, particularly with a newer master. So that's why this was very exciting. Now, in terms of the picture quality, even though it says a new 2K master, it doesn't mean it's perfect or it's been fully restored. It does look rather good, but you will have to expect some various print defects to pop up. I did notice in particular the opening did look very soft. So the opening titles and then the first 10 minutes or so do look rather on the soft side, but that may be just part of the actual original photography. I'm not for certain. There are a number of small lines that pop up, and of course some various specks and bits of damage here and there. They're not really obtrusive, but they are there. There is a little touch of frame wobble here and there. These are all things you will expect when it is a scan that has not been, fully restored frame by frame. And even if it's just a new scan, you will expect, obviously, various discrepancies to pop up like that. Nothing, again, that detracts from the experience. And it is a rather nice-looking HD presentation, but just don't go into this thinking that it's going to be absolutely pristine throughout. Because, again, even though it's a newer scan, it does have those things baked into the scan itself. The audio is lossless DTS HDMI mono. It does sound pretty good, but it does have some inherent crackle, hiss, and distortion, along with some sibilant bits and some ticks and occasional pops and things. So it's that means it hasn't been overly noise reduced, which is very good. But don't go into this expecting that it's going to be a perfectly clean track without any sort of inherent baked-in issues. So again, all of this seems intrinsic to the source, but it was quite a bit noisier than what you would expect for even titles of this vintage. So you will notice some bits of noise and some little bits of distortion here and there in terms of the highest frequencies of the various music cues. Now, I don't own the previous VHS and MOD releases of this, but I would assume, or I would think at least, that they were probably based on the same elements. So they probably should sound similar, but again, I've never owned those, so I don't know for certain. It still sounds excellent for what it is, but just be aware that there is going to be some intrinsic noise in the track, and that's just seems pretty much like the element that they had to transfer. That's just inherent to the source. Now, in terms of the extras, again, we get the film's original trailer, which is actually transferred in HD, which is a nice touch, and you can compare the footage in the trailer transfer-wise to the 2K master of the actual feature itself, and most trailers do usually wind up looking a bit different from the feature transfer. The main extra is the Sam Deacon commentary recorded for this release. As usual, with all the commentaries I've heard of hers, they are extremely well researched, very informative. She talks about the various key players involved in the film, their historical background, especially with Alan Ladd's career, and also the unfortunate blacklisting of the film's director Irving Pichel, and how even with this film under his belt, that didn't help when the Red Scare came around. But she also talks a great deal about the formation of the O.S.S. and the historical background to this film, and how the Office of Strategic Services really got off the ground and started operating during the war, and in the post-war period eventually transitioning over into becoming the CIA. So it's a great listen for if you wanted to know more information about the actual organization itself and the history of it, in addition to the history of the film. So it's one of those great tracks that also has a fantastic deal of the historical information and background of the film. So it's an essential listen if you watch this film on this Kino release. It is jam-packed with additional information. My only regret, though, is she does talk a little bit about Maibaum in the beginning of the track and the Bond connection. But I wish there was an additional commentary or something else from a diehard Bond expert, like perhaps Stephen J. Rubin, who's done some commentaries for Kino, because this is a gold mine for Bond fanatics. A Bond scholar can look at this film and probably write a thesis paper on just how much of the Bond DNA is here, and how much this is a precursor to Dr. No. I mean, it just is. So I come back to that, but that is what is going to be most rewarding for people. This is really for Bond fans. It is a must, an absolute must see. Actually, I'd say it's a must own, because this is one of the key Bond precursor films, so it really belongs on your shelf, because again, it has Maibaum's fingerprints all over it. And Alan Ladd is one of the key James Bond precursors in terms of great classic screen stars. So that's why I thought it was so important that this film finally got a Blu-ray release with an actual commentary extra, so it would hopefully reach a wider audience. It's a film that deserves to be talked about more often, to be greater known and recognized, and honestly, and quite frankly, it deserves to be seen by more people. And especially, this is a film that every Bond fan worth their salt needs to see at least several times, and to know about, and to be able to discuss and reference, because this is one of the absolute key bedrocks that is part of the foundation of the cinematic James Bond, in terms of the films and the characterization of the cinematic Bond. Maibaum getting to do a spy film in 1946 with great realism, starring Alan Ladd. I mean, that's just how many boxes can you check off the list in terms of Bond precursors? It's just every aspect of this film is a precursor to a Bond film. It just is, and it does it with a remarkable sense of gravitas, realism, suspense, while maintaining humanity. It is extremely well directed by Irving Pichel, with a great sense of the actual atmosphere of being in war-torn France and behind the enemy lines and in German occupied territories, and sort of helping you to get in that mindset of an operative at that time period under those constraints. So even though it's still a 1946 post-war thriller that is the first film to deal with this material, its legacy is just truly vast. So I highly encourage people to check this film out. It is a very affordable Kino Lorber release, as are almost all their titles. You can get it in one of their sales for very cheap as well, but with it having a new transfer and a lovely commentary track, I think it is an absolute must from the label. It's a film that I always wish had a nice deluxe release, and I never thought it would get a Blu-ray release. But absolutely paramount is the fact that this is one of the essential films for Bond fans. It truly is that important, and that's why I felt it was necessary to keep bringing that factor up, because as a Bond fanatic, getting to see O.S.S., you're just like, the whole time everything has a Bondian flavor, with a real panache, a real two-fisted, gritty approach with extreme realism. And it's a film that's not afraid to go into darker territories and have real gut punches to it. In particular, the ending is extremely striking and very well done. So that is why I think O.S.S. is one of the best and most important Kino Lorber releases of the past few years, and one of the most essential films for any James Bond fan to see, because it is truly part of the foundation of the cinematic James Bond. So that's my review of Kino Lorber's release of the 1946 spy thriller O.S.S., starring Alan Ladd, directed by Irving Pichel, and written and produced by the great Richard Maibaum. Again, it is one of the key James Bond precursors, and I am so happy it finally has a Blu-ray release. I think it's a wonderful release from Kino Lorber. While I wish it had been a fully restored, brand new 4K scan, the fact that it even got a newer transfer is wonderful. And even if the actual print quality itself, in terms of the picture and sound, is not fully 100% pristine, it is still a wonderful viewing experience that I think, again, all James Bond fans need in their lives. So if you've gotten this Kino release and already watched it, we'd love to hear your thoughts below, or if this sounds interesting to you, or if you're a fellow Bond fan and this at all rings any bells for you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I think this is a fascinating film from a truly fascinating time period in the studio system, the immediate post-war years where we started getting the darkest of film noirs and these really interesting spy thrillers that were dealing with the then new O.S.S. and in both World War II and the immediate post-war aftermath. So it's a fascinating little subgenre that does not really get talked about much, if really ever, and especially this film does not get discussed, and simply for the legacy as being part of the build-up to the James Bond films alone is reason to talk about it and praise it to the heavens, because it's just an enormous influence on the Bond films. If you are a Bond fan, you will get this from the opening. It's just that readily apparent. And all of this is because it's coming from the pen of Richard Maibaum. How could it not be have some of that Bond DNA? Because you've got the same writer getting to really do spy material fully for the first time with a bit of a free hand. So it's a fascinating film. It's an extremely entertaining and very suspenseful film with a great sense of realism, which really gives it staying power. And so I hope this has been informative, and I highly encourage everyone to check out this film, O.S.S. Whether you're a Bond fan or not, but particularly for Bond fans, this is an absolute must. It's a sort of 1940s Bond playbook for what was to come. That is the level of its influence, I think, and I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to make that claim. So as always, I hope this has been helpful, informative, and maybe somewhat fun listening to me babbling. And as always, I just want to say, keep supporting your boutique labels, keep supporting studio labels, keep your discs spinning, keep physical media alive, and thanks ever so much for watching.